I'm Sienna Blake, 32, and last month I got the same message I've received every June for the past 3 years. Sorry, sweetheart, not enough space for you at the Newport retreat this year. A few hours later, I saw the guest list, 118 names. All 5 of my siblings, their spouses, their kids, family friends, distant cousins, even my dad's college roommate. Everyone except me. For years, I've been the outsider in a family that celebrates perfection, just not mine. While my siblings pursued careers approved by our parents, finance, law, medicine, I built my own design firm in Brooklyn, one sketch and sleepless night at a time. I thought maybe, eventually, they'd see me. Turns out, I was always supposed to stay invisible. If you've ever felt like the family outcast, forgotten in rooms that should have been yours, hit that subscribe button, like this video, and share it with someone who needs to hear this. You're not alone. You really aren't. The annual Blake Family Retreat isn't just some beach trip, it's a decades-old tradition. My grandparents, James and Rose, bought the sprawling oceanfront estate in Newport, Rhode Island when I was 6. Grandpa James used to say, "This place is where we come to remember who we are." And when he said that, he meant all of us. I still remember the scent of sea salt and sunscreen as we tumbled across the dunes. My brothers would race up the bluff, pretending to be pirates. My sisters helped Grandma gather wildflowers for the dinner table. And me? Grandpa handed me a sketch pad and said, "You don't just look, Sienna. You see?" He noticed it before anyone else did. My way of seeing the world, of capturing it in lines and light. I was the quiet one, the one who didn't fit the mold, the one who kept drawing even when Dad called it a nice little hobby. I always thought I'd have space at that table, no matter what, that even if I didn't follow their path, I'd still be counted. But each year, the message came. Each year, I made excuses for them. They must really be cutting back. They probably think I'm too busy. But last month, Blake, my brother, who rarely posts anything, shared a photo on Instagram of the itinerary. And there it was, a printed schedule for the largest Blake family retreat yet. 118 guests. They even rented additional villas next door. And yet, still not enough space for me. I stared at the screen, heart pounding, fingers trembling. I counted names I hadn't heard in years, cousins I barely remembered, people I hadn't even realized were still in touch with us. My name was nowhere. Not a typo, not an oversight, a choice. For a long time, I sat frozen in my Brooklyn apartment, surrounded by the success I'd built. My awards, framed client campaigns, press features on my studio, things I thought they'd be proud of. But to them, they were still just projects. That moment wasn't the beginning of the hurt. It was the breaking point. And deep down, I knew. This year would be different. I wish I could tell you that was the first time I'd felt invisible in my family. But the truth is, the pattern started long before the text messages or the guest lists. To understand how much it all hurt, you have to know what this place, the Newport retreat, meant to me. Before it became a symbol of exclusion, it was my sanctuary. My grandparents, James and Rose Blake, were the kind of love story people write novels about. He was a Navy officer stationed in Rhode Island. She was a florist's daughter with calloused hands and a poet's heart. They met on a wind-swept cliff during a summer storm, fell in love by fall, and married within a year. When he retired, they bought a crumbling Victorian estate perched above the ocean and made it into something magical, something ours. Every summer, they opened its white-shuttered windows, scrubbed the porch swings, and filled the home with the scent of lavender and lemon polish. They didn't just host vacations. They hosted belonging. It wasn't about who had the fanciest job or the most polished kids. It was about being together, wild and imperfect, sunburnt and sandy, huddled around a driftwood fire with marshmallows stuck to our fingers. That house became the backdrop of my earliest joy. I was the youngest grandchild by several years, often left in the wake of older cousins' games I couldn't keep up with. But Grandpa James noticed. He'd place his weathered hand on my shoulder, hand me a spiral-bound sketch pad, and say, "Don't run after them, Sienna. Watch, that's where the art is." He taught me how to see, not just look, the way light shifted on water, the curve of a gull's wing, the emotion tucked inside stillness. I didn't know it then, but he was handing me the first tools of my future. "You have a different kind of voice," he told me once, as I sat on the porch painting the ocean in shades of violet and slate. "It may not echo loud like theirs, but it carries." My grandmother, Rose, wasn't one for speeches, but she was magic in her own way. She made everyone feel wanted. If you showed up late or unannounced, there was always a place setting added with a smile. Her kitchen smelled like honey and thyme. Her hugs lingered. And when I told her at 16 that I wanted to apply to art school instead of the business program my parents had planned for me, she didn't blink. She just said, "Good, this world needs fewer spreadsheets and more beauty." When I got in, with a scholarship no less, my parents barely reacted. My father muttered something about starving artists. My mother didn't even ask what city the school was in. But Grandpa James and Grandma Rose mailed me a check for new supplies and a note that said, "Go be exactly who you are." They believed in me, fiercely, quietly, unconditionally. Their passing, within 6 months of each other, was the first time I truly understood what loss meant. It wasn't just them we lost. It was the soul of the family. After that, the Newport retreat changed. The warm welcome turned to curated guest lists. The meals became catered. The laughter replaced by polite clinks of champagne flutes. And I started to disappear from the edges inward. But back then, before all the silence and omissions, I was the girl with the sketch pad and a grandfather who said my voice mattered. And some days, that memory is what holds me together. After my grandparents passed, it didn't happen all at once. The unraveling. It was slow, like a tide pulling back just far enough that you barely notice what's missing. Until one day, you're standing alone on dry sand, wondering where the waves went. Grandpa James died first, peacefully, in his sleep. Grandma Rose followed 6 months later, as if her body couldn't bear the silence he left behind. I was a sophomore in college when I got the call. I remember dropping my paintbrush mid-stroke and staring at my canvas like I could make sense of it in color. But grief doesn't translate. They left the Newport estate to my parents, Martin and Elaine, with a handwritten letter tucked inside the legal paperwork. It was short, warm, and hopeful. "We hope the traditions we've started will continue, with joy, with love, and with inclusion. This place is for all of us." My mother framed the letter, but she never read it out loud. That first summer without them, the retreat went on, but the air was different. The impromptu scavenger hunts were gone. No more fresh blueberry pies cooling on the windowsill. No more paint-splattered afternoons with Grandma or starry night storytelling with Grandpa. The laughter faded into polite conversation. The magic diluted. My parents took over planning with the efficiency of a corporate merger. Guest lists tripled. My father invited colleagues and clients. My mother added her charity board friends and yoga instructor. Suddenly, we had color-coded itineraries and branded cocktail napkins. It wasn't a retreat anymore. It was a showcase. And somehow, my seat started slipping further away from the table. I tried not to take it personally. I told myself it was just a new phase. But deep down, I knew. Their love for me had been the shield. With them gone, there was no buffer between me and my parents' disapproval. They never said the words outright, but it showed in the way they introduced me. While my siblings were Dr. Blake, VP of Strategy or Managing Partner, I was still doing her art thing in New York. My accomplishments, magazine features, brand campaigns, a growing list of Fortune 500 clients, never made it to the group email updates. I learned about births, job promotions, even engagements through secondhand conversations. Slowly, I started feeling like a ghost in my own family. And yet, I kept showing up. I bought new dresses for dinners where no one asked me about my work. I brought thoughtful gifts and listened to endless stories about nieces I'd never met. I convinced myself I was lucky to still be invited. Until one year, I wasn't. I remember the exact moment the first exclusion arrived, not as a door slammed shut, but as a text message, casual and cold. "Hi, sweetie. Just a heads up. We're keeping the retreat small this year. Only immediate family. Not enough space for everyone. Hope you understand." Immediate family. I stared at the words like they were written in another language. My fingers hovered over the screen, unsure what to respond. The message had come from my mother's number, short and sterile, sent 2 weeks before the retreat. I sat on my studio floor in Brooklyn, surrounded by color palettes and client mock-ups, frozen. It didn't feel real. There had to be a mistake. I told myself it didn't matter. Maybe they really were scaling back. Maybe I wasn't immediate enough anymore. I tried to shake it off, threw myself into a project for a sustainable fashion brand. I told Leah, my best friend, that I had no interest in lounging on a beach anyway. But at night, it stung. More than I admitted. I kept waiting for a follow-up text, an apology, an explanation, anything. It never came. The truth hit when my sister-in-law posted a carousel of smiling photos on Instagram. Champagne glasses clinking. My siblings, sun-kissed and laughing on the lawn. A catered seafood spread under string lights. Fireworks over the water. One of the pictures showed a long dining table with place cards. 14 adults, 10 kids, and several people I didn't even recognize. Small gathering, huh? I zoomed in on one photo, a group shot in front of the cliffside gazebo. My seat would have been right there, between my brother Nathan and our cousin Marcy, but instead, there was a woman I didn't know, her name scrawled in cursive on a little card where mine never was. I wanted to believe it was an oversight, so I called my sister Elise. "Hey, I saw some of the retreat pictures. Looked beautiful," I said, trying to sound breezy. She hesitated. "Oh, yeah, it was nice. Kind of a last-minute thing." 100 people at a last-minute thing? She sighed. "Look, I think Mom and Dad figured you'd be swamped with work. You're always so busy." I laughed softly, but it wasn't humor. "Did anyone think to ask?" There was silence, then a tired, "Sienna, it's not personal." But it was. It always had been. That night, I lay in bed and let the tears come. Not loud or dramatic, just slow and steady, like the ocean hitting the shore, relentless, quiet, and impossible to stop. Because for the first time, I couldn't pretend anymore. I wasn't just left out by accident. I was being edited out, deliberately, quietly, without ceremony, and I wasn't sure which hurt more, their silence or my years of making excuses for it. The following year, the message came earlier. This time, it was cloaked in even more politeness. "Sienna, we're keeping things small again, just the siblings and their families. We didn't want to overwhelm the property." I didn't respond. What was there to say? I wasn't surprised anymore. But that didn't mean it hurt any less. That summer, I avoided social media completely. I buried myself in client work, producing 3 full campaigns in 6 weeks. My team called it one of our most creative bursts. They didn't know it came from a place of aching silence. When the event ended, photos still found me, sent in group threads, tagged innocently by extended cousins, always smiling faces, always that same house, always that same table. Without me. By the 3rd year, it was less of a shock, more of a confirmation, a quiet resignation that I had officially become the blank space on the family roster. It wasn't just that I hadn't been invited, it was that no one mentioned it. No one asked how I felt about it. No one even pretended to explain. It became normal. And that was the part that stung the most. Elise once told me, "You're so independent. I always figured you didn't care about that kind of thing." But independence isn't the absence of need. It's the result of unmet ones. I began to look back, revisiting memories through a new lens. The Christmas where everyone else received personalized gifts and I got a generic coffee table book. The family newsletter that listed everyone's career promotions but left me out entirely. The wedding seating chart where I was placed at the table with distant family friends instead of with my siblings. It was death by 1,000 paper cuts, and each time I swallowed it, smiled through it, pretended it didn't matter. I gave them permission to do it again. Sometimes I'd find myself staring at the framed note from Grandma Rose, the one she sent me with my first set of real watercolors. You don't have to become what they expect, just become fully yourself. But being fully myself meant being an artist in a family that valued bank statements over brushstrokes. My father, Martin, once told me during a holiday dinner, "It's great you enjoy your work, Sienna, but someday you'll need a real plan." I remember nodding, clenching my jaw so tight my molars ached. He didn't ask about the brand I had just signed, a national campaign worth 6 figures. He didn't know I was flying to Paris the next month to speak at a design symposium. None of that mattered, not in the world where spreadsheets were gospel and anything creative was a hobby, so I learned to celebrate in silence, to clap for myself when no one else did, and to build something beautiful with the very hands they tried to dismiss. But even silence has its limits, and I was beginning to reach mine. Eventually, even the strongest facade starts to crack. It was a Thursday night in early June, and I was supposed to be finalizing pitch mock-ups for a boutique hotel chain in Lisbon, but I couldn't concentrate. My hands hovered above my stylus, then dropped to my lap. I stared at the glowing screen of my phone. A photo had just appeared on my feed, Nathan's wife, grinning in a sun hat with the caption, "Newport, we're back, annual Blake retreat begins." I hadn't even received the courtesy of a text this year. I don't know how long I sat there, but at some point, the ache in my chest gave way to something deeper, a trembling that started in my shoulders and worked its way down to my ribcage. It wasn't rage. It was grief. Raw and sharp and old. I called Leah without thinking. She answered on the second ring. "Hey, you okay?" "They did it again," I whispered. She didn't need clarification. "The retreat?" I nodded even though she couldn't see me. 118 people, Leah. They even rented extra cottages this year, and still, no room for me. There was a long pause on her end, filled only with the ambient hum of her Brooklyn apartment. "That's not about space," she said finally, her voice steady. "That's about punishment." My throat tightened. "Do you really think they're punishing me?" "Yes," she said gently. "Not for anything you did wrong, but for choosing a life they didn't pick. For becoming someone they can't control." I let that settle. Because deep down, I knew she was right. My entire adult life had been a silent rebellion. I didn't just veer off the path they'd paved. I built a different road altogether. One that didn't include their expectations. One they never tried to walk with me on. But naming it out loud made the wound feel real, and real pain is harder to ignore. "I just keep hoping they'll change," I admitted. "That one day they'll finally say they're proud." Leah sighed. "But what happens if they don't?" That was the question I hadn't dared to ask myself. What happens if the apology never comes? What happens if the people you thought would fight for you don't? There was a time when that idea would have gutted me. But now, hearing Leah ask it aloud, something shifted. A small voice inside whispered, "Then you choose yourself anyway." That night, I sat on my windowsill, staring out over the lights of Brooklyn. My tea had gone cold. My inbox was full. My career was thriving. And yet, I felt hollow. Not because of the work I'd done, but because I'd spent so long trying to prove myself to people who refused to see me. But maybe, just maybe, I didn't need their permission anymore. Sleep didn't come that night. I lay in the dark with my phone clutched in my hand, the screen casting a dull light across my ceiling as if it might illuminate something inside me. 100 names had made the Newport list this year, and still, no one thought to ask me why I wasn't there. Around 3:12 a.m., I finally tapped Elise's name. I knew she'd be up. Her youngest, Ava, was teething, and insomnia had become a shared reality between us lately, even if our reasons differed. She picked up with a groggy, "Hello?" "Elise," I said softly. Do you know I wasn't invited to the retreat this year? There was a pause. A long one. Mom mentioned you were probably slammed with work. I sat up. But no one asked. No one checked. You all just assumed I'd be too busy again. Sienna, she said, her voice cautious. You know how it is. Mom and Dad handle the invites. I didn't even see the final list until last week. But you saw the photos, I said. The ones with everyone, the extra cottages, the place settings. You knew I wasn't there. Another silence. I could almost hear her heartbeat on the line. I did, she admitted. I just didn't know what to say. Elise, how many years do I have to be missing before someone says something? She exhaled slowly. You're different, Sienna. You always have been. I blinked. What does that mean? It means you live in New York. You're single. You run this business we don't really understand. It's hard for Mom and Dad to connect with that. With you. I swallowed hard. So, I deserve to be left out because I didn't marry a lawyer or give them grandkids? No, she said quickly. That's not what I meant. You know I've always admired you. How you built something on your own. But you let them pretend I don't exist, I whispered. You watched them erase me. Her voice cracked. I didn't know how to stop it. And maybe that was the most honest thing either of us had said. We sat in the stillness for a moment, two sisters drifting across a chasm that had taken years to form. Elise wasn't malicious, she was complicit, and that, in some ways, hurt more. You could have asked, I said gently. You could have pushed back. Even once. I know. I don't need you to fight my battles, I added, but I needed someone to notice I was bleeding. There was a muffled sob on the other end, and then a whispered, I'm sorry. For a second, I wanted to forgive her, wrap it all up neatly, like a bow on a broken gift, but I couldn't. Not yet. I wasn't done bleeding. I'm not angry, I said quietly. Just tired. Tired of hoping they'll change. You shouldn't have to carry that, Elise said. It's not fair. No, it's not, I agreed. And for the first time, I let that truth stand unsoftened. I didn't hang up angry, but I did hang up changed, because after that call, something inside me finally shifted. If I couldn't find space in the family I was born into, maybe it was time to build a space of my own. After the call with Elise, I didn't sleep. I just sat at my kitchen counter in silence, listening to the distant hum of traffic beyond my Brooklyn windows. The skyline blinked in quiet rhythm, indifferent to my ache. But beneath that ache, something else stirred. Not revenge, not even anger, just a question. What if I stopped waiting for space and created it instead? I opened my laptop. I wasn't sure why at first, habit maybe, but my fingers moved instinctively, opening tabs I hadn't visited in years. Luxury rentals near Newport, boutique estates, private properties with enough space for something different. And then I saw it. Ocean View Cliffside Estate, a modern structure of glass and stone nestled into the bluff. 6 bedrooms, floor-to-ceiling windows, a wraparound deck that overlooked the Atlantic like it was meant to witness transformation. The week of the family retreat? Available. I stared at the screen. My heart thudded in my chest. It wasn't about throwing a competing event. I didn't want to steal attention. I wanted to claim something, my joy, my worth, my right to belong, on my terms. I imagined artists scattered across that deck, sunlight filtering through their brushes, writers curled up with notebooks under woven blankets, late-night bonfires, morning yoga, gourmet meals and honest laughter. People who saw me, who chose me, not out of obligation, but because they wanted to. Not a replacement for my family, but a reclamation of myself. I could hear Grandpa James in my mind, his voice steady behind me. Don't wait for permission, Sienna. Build anyway. That afternoon, I had lunch with Camilla. one of my longtime clients who had become a trusted friend. We met at a rooftop cafe in Soho, the kind of place where you could see the whole city bend at the edges. She asked how I was doing, and I told her the truth, all of it. By the time I finished, her wine glass was still full, but her eyes were burning. "You're not crazy," she said. "You're just exhausted from holding what they won't acknowledge." Then she leaned in. "Let's build something better. I plan experiences for a living. You design for a living. Let's make this beautiful." And just like that, it began. We spent the next hour scribbling ideas on a paper napkin, names of chefs she'd worked with, musicians I could invite, designers and photographers and storytellers, a creative minds retreat, a celebration of artistry and inclusion. I could almost feel the air on that cliff already. It was still just a seed, but it was real. And for the first time in years, I felt like I was growing toward something, not away from it. This wasn't about proving anything anymore. It was about remembering who I was, and finally building a place that could hold all of me. The vision came fast, but the building? That was slower, heavier, real. The day after lunch with Camilla, I blocked off my calendar for 2 hours and opened a blank whiteboard in my project planner, the same software I used for global brand launches. But this wasn't for a client. It was for me. At the top, I wrote, "The Creative Minds Retreat, Ocean View, Newport." And then, without hesitation, I moved every savings goal I'd been working toward, new condo, art residency in Kyoto, studio expansion, into a new folder labeled Retreat. The rental fee for the estate made my chest tighten. It was more than I'd ever spent on anything personal, but this wasn't personal, not in the small sense. It was sacred. Camilla and I met again that weekend, this time at her studio in Tribeca, surrounded by silk table runners and floral mock-ups. She poured tea and pulled out a binder full of vendor contacts. "We'll need a chef, not fancy but thoughtful, someone who gets what this is." "I'm thinking workshops," I said, "but not forced ones. Organic, optional, intimate." She grinned. "Sienna, this is going to be unforgettable." We mapped it all out. Sunset yoga led by David, a mutual friend and certified instructor. Pottery on the deck led by Miranda, a ceramicist I met at an art residency in Santa Fe. Morning photography walks with Troy, whose eye for light was unmatched, creative journaling, group dinners with conversation cards, blank time for reflection, bonfires by the cliff. I wanted every detail to feel intentional, like what Grandpa James and Grandma Rose used to do. Not big, not flashy, but deeply human. Wildflowers on the table, local honey in the welcome baskets, handwritten notes, and the invitations. Those would be personal too. Leah, of course, was the first name on my list. Then Miranda, Camilla, a handful of clients who had become more like collaborators, fellow designers I'd met at conferences, friends from art school I hadn't seen in years but never forgot, my college roommate and her partner, people who had lifted me up, celebrated me without condition, even in seasons I hadn't celebrated myself. And then, 2 names that made my heart hesitate, Heather and Nathan, my siblings. Heather had always sent a quiet word of encouragement after each feature or launch. Nathan once defended me at a family dinner when Dad dismissed my business as a side hustle. Maybe they wouldn't come. Maybe the invitation would feel like a line drawn in the sand. But maybe, just maybe, it would be a hand extended. By the end of the week, I had 19 names locked in, 19 people who saw me, 19 reasons to keep going. I built the website myself, of course I did. Soft blues, muted golds, brushstroke accents, curated photos of the estate. The words on the homepage read, "A retreat for those who create, connect, and see the world a little differently." For the first time in years, I felt like I wasn't just reacting to pain, I was responding with purpose. And maybe that's what healing really is. Not forgetting what broke you, but choosing to build something beautiful in its place. Planning a retreat sounded poetic. Living in that plan day by day, it was something else entirely. Once the vision was set and the names were confirmed, reality rushed in like a cold wind. I had exactly 5 weeks to pull off something it typically takes event planners months to coordinate. And I wasn't just the host. I was the designer, the budget manager, the logistics coordinator, and the emotional engine behind it all. Camila was a godsend. She pulled favors from her network like a magician. We secured a catering company that specialized in farm-to-table menus, a housekeeping team for daily turn-down service, and a local rental vendor for outdoor lounge furniture. I created a digital itinerary and branded signage, while Camila coordinated floral deliveries and verified insurance paperwork. Evenings became a blur. After finishing client deadlines, I'd spend hours packing welcome boxes, customizing journals with each attendee's name, and designing print materials so every detail felt intentional. But the pressure started catching up with me. I hadn't realized how much was riding on this until I found myself standing in the middle of my studio, surrounded by unopened supply boxes, paralyzed. It wasn't just about logistics. It was about me. What if no one showed up? What if it all felt forced? What if they saw right through it? And through me? This wasn't just an event. It was a mirror, a risk, a declaration of self-worth, wrapped in rented linens and hand-stitched place cards. I took a deep breath and called Leah. She didn't answer, so I left a message. "I don't know if I can do this," I said quietly. "It feels too big, too bold, like I'm asking for too much." She texted back within minutes. "You're not asking for too much. You're asking for what you've always deserved. Keep going." The next morning, I recentered myself the way I knew best. I sat at my drafting table and sketched the ocean view deck from memory, the silhouettes of friends in conversation, the sun melting into the sea, the promise of something sacred. That image reminded me why I'd started. This wasn't about impressing anyone. It was about reclaiming a space I was told didn't exist. In the days that followed, responses trickled in. Miranda confirmed with excitement, "I've been craving something like this." David offered to bring yoga mats and music equipment. Troy asked if he could bring his partner. Even Heather replied, gracious and warm, "This sounds incredible, Sienna. It's more my speed than the formal family thing." Nathan declined, kindly. "I'll be with the kids at Newport, but I admire what you're doing. I mean that." I didn't cry when I read that message. I just nodded. It wasn't resentment. It was clarity. Not everyone needed to show up, just the ones who made room for me without needing to be asked twice. The retreat was happening. It was real. And for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel like I was waiting for someone to hand me a seat at the table. I was building the table myself, piece by piece, intention by intention, day by beautiful day. It all felt like it was finally coming together, until it didn't. 3 days before I was set to drive up to Newport, I got the call. The catering company we had booked, carefully vetted, contract signed, menus finalized, had double booked. A corporate retreat at a tech compound in Boston. More money. Less soul. "We're so sorry," the manager said. "We can refund your deposit and offer a discount for a future event." I was silent. A future event? There might not be one. I hung up and stared at my phone. My hands were shaking. 22 guests. 5 days. Gourmet meals, 3 times a day, plus snacks, dietary restrictions, and the promise, my promise, of a nourishing experience. I sat down on my studio floor, surrounded by tote bags filled with welcome gifts. I was halfway through assembling them, jars of local jam, hand-poured candles, custom sketchbooks. Everything designed with care. Now all I could see was what was missing, what might fall apart, what I couldn't control. And for a moment, I spiraled. What was I thinking? Who did I think I was, trying to pull this off? I wasn't a hospitality expert. I was a designer with a Pinterest board and a trauma wound. Was this just an expensive attempt to heal? I buried my face in my hands. The tears came fast, hot, angry, full of shame. I didn't want to call anyone. I didn't want to admit what had happened. I just sat there, small. But then, almost without thinking, I opened my phone and texted Leah. "The caterer canceled. I think I just ruined everything." She replied instantly, "No, you didn't. Sit tight, I'm calling someone." Within 20 minutes, my phone lit up with a FaceTime from an unfamiliar number. "Hey, Sienna, I'm Sophia. Leah said you might need a miracle." Sophia was a personal chef who had trained at the Culinary Institute of America and had just wrapped up a pop-up residency in the Berkshires. She was in between projects, available, curious. I emailed her the original menus and the guest list. She responded within the hour. "I'd suggest simplifying the dinner pacing," she said, "but we can elevate it with seasonal touches and interactive elements. Make it more personal, less formal, more connected." Her tone wasn't just competent, it was kind. She got it. By sunset, she had agreed to take the job. She'd bring her own team. She even suggested custom plating designs based on my retreat logo. What had felt like a disaster transformed into an upgrade. And that night, as I taped the final label onto the last welcome basket, I realized something I hadn't before. Maybe the universe wasn't trying to sabotage me. Maybe it was stripping away anything that didn't belong in the space I was trying to build. This retreat wasn't meant to be perfect. It was meant to be true. And sometimes truth arrives in the form of crisis, just to ask if you still believe in what you're building. I did, more than ever. The morning I left Brooklyn, the city was still asleep. I loaded the car in silence, box after box, carefully packed with curated details and months of emotion. My hands moved with purpose, but my chest was tight. Not with fear, exactly, with knowing. This was no longer an idea. It was real. The drive to Newport took just under 4 hours, but it felt longer, like I was crossing some unseen threshold between the life I'd been surviving and the one I was about to claim. When I pulled up the long gravel driveway of the Ocean View Cliffside Estate, the house greeted me like an exhale. It was even more beautiful than I remembered, a symphony of glass and stone, perched like it belonged to the cliff itself. Floor-to-ceiling windows wrapped the living room, framing the sea like a painting that breathed. The gardens were wild but intentional, lavender, rosemary, tall grasses waving in the salt breeze. And just beyond the wraparound deck, the Atlantic sparkled under a cloudless sky. For a moment I just sat in my car, staring. I had made this happen. A property manager greeted me at the door, gave me a quick tour, then handed over the keys with a clipboard and a smile. "You've got the place until Sunday," he said. "Enjoy it. She's special." When he drove off, the stillness that followed was sacred. I walked through each room slowly, barefoot, letting the space introduce itself. The kitchen was sunlit and spacious, the bedrooms airy and modern, with just enough rustic charm. But it was the great room that stopped me cold, its view opening to sea and sky in a way that made everything else fall quiet. I stood there for a long time, not working, not decorating, just being, letting it sink in. Then, I got to work. I arranged the welcome baskets in each room, locally made soaps, small bottles of California wine, artisan chocolates, custom sketchbooks with the retreat logo I'd designed, and a handwritten note for each guest. I wanted them to feel chosen, because they were. For Heather's basket, I added a small photo I'd found in an old album. Us as kids, painting on the porch at Grandpa James and Grandma Rose's place. It was the only photo I had where we both looked fully free. By sunset, the house was glowing with intention. Candles lit, music low, the scent of lavender drifting from the diffuser in the entryway. Every corner had been touched with care, not to impress, but to invite. Just as I stepped onto the deck to catch the last bit of sun, my phone buzzed. A message from my mother. "Hope you're enjoying your summer, sweetheart. Anything special planned for next week?" It was almost laughable, as if I hadn't noticed the exclusion, as if I were still playing the part of the unaware daughter. I didn't reply. Instead, I took a photo of the sunset pouring gold across the ocean and posted it to Instagram. Let the creative minds retreat, begin. Emerging from the shadows. No tags. No names. Just a quiet statement. A lighthouse for anyone watching. I knew Heather followed me. I suspected others in my family did too. For once, I didn't care. Because tomorrow, people would arrive. People who had said yes without hesitation. People who had made space for me without needing to be asked. And this time, I was ready. By mid-morning, the stillness of the estate gave way to movement, car doors opening, footsteps on gravel, the hum of voices finding each other again. Leah was the first to arrive, her vintage Volvo packed with journals, incense, and a thermos of herbal tea she insisted I drink immediately. She stepped out, took one look at the house, and exhaled. "Damn," she said, turning slowly. "You really did this." I nodded. I couldn't find the words, so I just pulled her into a hug that said everything I didn't know how to say. Next came Troy and his partner Daniel, lugging camera gear and an energy that felt like sunlight. Miranda arrived not long after, her hands already tracing the space where she'd set up her pottery wheel. The rest followed in waves, Camila with her spreadsheets and soul, David with yoga mats slung over his shoulder, and a handful of creatives I hadn't seen in years, but who stepped into the house like they already belonged. Each arrival brought fresh joy, every hug a stitch, pulling something torn back together. By late afternoon, the house was alive. Laughter spilled down the hallway. Music floated from the kitchen, where Sophia was already prepping a welcome dinner, her voice soft but commanding as she gave instructions to her team. Candles flickered in the main room. Someone had lit sage. It didn't feel like a production. It felt like breath. As sunset painted the sky, Heather arrived. She stepped out of a rideshare car wearing jeans, a linen blouse, and that expression she wore when she wasn't sure whether she was allowed to relax. But when our eyes met, her shoulders dropped. She walked up the porch steps slowly and wrapped her arms around me. "This is incredible," she whispered. "I had no idea you were planning something like this." I smiled. "You're here. That's what matters." She looked around, visibly stunned by the calm, the colors, the energy. "This feels like what the retreat used to feel like. Before it became—" She paused, choosing her words. "A presentation." We stood in that silence for a moment. No defense, no explanation needed. Just as I was about to show her to her room, my phone buzzed again. "Blake." I opened the message. "That place looks amazing. What's this retreat thing about?" Seconds later, another ping. "Amanda. FYI, Mom's asking why Heather is with you and not at the family retreat." I didn't reply. Not yet. Instead, I led Heather inside and offered her a glass of wine. The dining table was set. Sophia was plating the first course, a saffron risotto with roasted squash and thyme oil. It looked like art. At dinner, I stood to welcome everyone officially. My voice shook for the first few seconds, but I steadied. "Thank you for being here," I said, "for saying yes, for choosing this space. This retreat isn't about hierarchy or hustle. It's about presence, creation, and reclaiming the parts of ourselves we've been told were too much, or not enough." Glasses clinked. People smiled. And for the first time, I felt it settle in my bones. This wasn't just healing. It was homecoming. After dinner, I sat on the deck watching the waves turn black under moonlight, grateful in a way that didn't need to be spoken. The next morning, I woke to texts. Brian, Lily, even Dad. They had seen the posts, and the silence I'd once begged to break was suddenly filled with questions. But this time, I wasn't answering on their terms. I woke early the next morning, before the sun had fully crested the horizon. The estate was quiet again, soft, golden light stretching across the hardwood floors, the scent of coffee and rosemary drifting in from the kitchen. I padded barefoot through the great room, pulled a blanket around my shoulders, and stepped onto the deck. The ocean was calm, still. For a few sacred moments, it felt like the world held its breath with me. But peace, like all things, has a way of being tested. Just after breakfast, as I was setting up the art station on the back patio with Leah, a car pulled into the driveway. Not a rideshare, a black luxury SUV. Leah squinted toward the front of the estate. Expecting someone else? I wasn't. And when I saw who stepped out, my breath caught. Amanda. And trailing behind her, in a crisp navy linen jacket and polished loafers, Dad. I felt my chest tighten, but I didn't move. I didn't rush to greet them. I didn't shrink. I just stood there, paint-stained fingers still curled around a mason jar of brushes, letting the silence speak first. Amanda approached like she always did, poised, performative, a thin smile stretched across her face. "Wow, Sienna," she said, glancing around. "This place is more than I expected." Dad hung back near the porch, his hands clasped in front of him, studying the house, the people, the view, saying nothing, calculating, the way he always did. "What are you doing here?" I asked, voice calm but firm. "We were in the area," Amanda replied too quickly. "Thought we'd drop by. Heather told us a little about what you were planning." "Did she invite you?" That landed. Her smile faltered. "No," she admitted, "but we figured, since you're part of the family," I held up a hand, "you don't get to show up now, not after years of erasing me, of watching me scrape my way through without even a call." Amanda bristled. "That's not fair." "No," I said. "What's not fair is being made to feel like an outsider in my own bloodline. What's not fair is pretending I didn't exist unless it benefited someone's image." Dad finally spoke. "We didn't know this meant so much to you." I turned to him slowly. "You didn't ask." His eyes flicked toward the ocean, avoiding mine. "I built this with nothing but grit and grace," I continued. "No favors, no inheritance, no support. And now that it's beautiful, now that it's gaining attention, you show up. Why? To claim credit? To compare it to your legacy?" Amanda stepped forward. "We're here because we care." "No," I said. "You're here because you're curious, or maybe embarrassed, but you don't get to rewrite the story now that it's unfolding without you." A hush fell over the group that had gathered nearby. Heather, Leah, even Sophia standing just inside the kitchen door, listening. I turned back to Amanda and Dad. "You can stay for lunch if you're hungry, but you're not here to take up space, not this time." They said nothing. Amanda looked stricken. Dad just nodded once. And then, quietly, they left. No tantrums, no dramatic exits, just the soft closing of a door that had once led me to constant seeking. As they pulled away, Heather came to my side. "You were steady," she said, "unapologetic." I let out a long breath I hadn't realized I was holding. For the first time, I didn't feel like I had to prove anything. And that, somehow, was everything. The hours after they left felt unusually quiet, like the house itself was catching its breath. I didn't speak much for the rest of that afternoon. I didn't need to. My body was tired, but in that good, necessary way, the kind that comes after standing your ground and not collapsing under the weight of it. I wandered down to the shoreline while the others held a movement session on the bluff with David. The tide had pulled back, revealing clusters of sea glass and tangled kelp. I ran my fingers through the cool, damp sand. I hadn't realized how long it had been since I allowed myself to just be. No agenda, no proving, just being Sienna. The waves came in slow, steady, and with them, I felt the rhythm of something I'd long forgotten, my own internal pace. Later, back inside, the creative energy that had been simmering all weekend finally bubbled over. The great room turned into a whirl of color, sound, and scent. Leah's journaling workshop spilled into spontaneous poetry readings. Miranda's hands were caked in clay, spinning tiny bowls that looked like offerings to the earth itself. Camilla pinned watercolor sketches on the wall beside the fireplace, and Sophia was humming in the kitchen again, this time baking something with rosemary and pear that made the whole house feel like a warm embrace. Heather sat beside me on the porch swing as twilight melted into lavender dusk. She had her notebook open, doodling quietly. I glanced at her page and saw it. A sketch of me. Not as I looked now, but younger, thinner, smaller somehow. But beneath it, she was drawing new lines, bolder ones. "I used to remember you like this," she said softly, "but that's not who you are anymore." I swallowed a lump in my throat. Who am I now? She looked up and smiled. The woman who didn't flinch when Dad tried to show up late to her story. I let out a laugh, sharp and wet around the edges. I never wanted to be the rebel, you know. I just wanted to be seen. And now you are, she said. But more importantly, you see yourself. The truth of it settled between us. That night, we lit a fire outside and gathered in a circle. One by one, people shared what they'd created, what they were releasing, what they were reclaiming. When it came to me, I didn't read or perform. I just held up a small mosaic I'd pieced together from sea glass and stone. At the center was a cracked mirror. "This is what it's felt like," I said. "Building beauty from pieces they never thought I'd hold." Silence followed. Then applause, then tears, mine included. We stayed there long after the fire burned low, bundled in blankets and bare vulnerability. And for the first time in years, I didn't feel like I was waiting for permission to shine. Morning came quietly. The coastal light filtered in through the gauzy curtains, golden and forgiving. I sat up slowly, blankets tangled around my legs, and let the weight of the silence settle around me like armor finally being laid down. The retreat had just one more day left, and somehow I already felt different than the woman who arrived here 6 days ago. Not because of anything flashy, not because of applause or accolades, but because, for once, I wasn't shrinking in rooms I had built. Downstairs, the kitchen buzzed with a gentle hum. Sophia making tea, David stretching by the open patio doors, Heather scribbling notes on the back of a to-do list she'd long stopped following. It was calm, familiar, and sacred in its simplicity. I wandered into the sunroom, where our final reflection circle would be held. A long oval of pillows had been arranged on the floor, each place marked with a single card and a stone. On the card was a prompt. "What are you taking with you that no one else can name?" I stared at mine for a while before answering. There were so many things, pieces of me I hadn't even realized I'd left scattered across years of survival. Before the others arrived, I stepped outside to breathe. Just breathe. That's when I saw her. Claire. She was walking up the drive with hesitation in her steps, a soft duffel slung over her shoulder. Her hair was pulled back, eyes puffy like she hadn't slept much. And yet, there she was. My oldest childhood friend, the one who had pulled away when I began pulling boundaries tighter. She stopped just shy of the front steps, hand hovering near the strap of her bag like she wasn't sure if she was welcome. "I wasn't going to come," she said, voice trembling. I swallowed the emotion rising fast in my chest. "Then why are you here?" She looked up at me, eyes glassy. "Because I watched your live stream, the one from the Mosaic Circle, and I remembered who you were before the silence between us." My throat tightened. "A lot of people forgot." "I didn't," she said. "I just didn't know how to handle your light when mine was dimming." I exhaled slowly, unsure whether to laugh, cry, or just let it sit there. "I'm not here to fix anything," she added. "I just wanted to witness what you've built, to say I'm sorry, and maybe to sit in the back if you'll let me." I stepped aside and nodded. She entered quietly. No grand reunion, no easy repair, but something shifted, something softened. Later that afternoon, while everyone gathered in the sunroom for the final reflection, Claire sat near the doorway, silent, watching. When it was my turn to speak, I didn't share the answer I wrote on my card. Instead, I spoke directly from the ache in my heart. "I'm taking back the right to belong," I said. "Not because I was invited, but because I decided I didn't need the invitation." And this time, the applause didn't feel like validation. It felt like harmony. The house felt different on the final morning. Not empty, just exhaled. Like it too had released something. I stood in the main hallway with my hand resting on the worn banister, looking out the large window that framed the shoreline. The sky was soft and overcast, the kind of gray that wrapped everything in calm. Guests had started to pack up, their laughter echoing faintly from room to room as bags zipped and doors creaked open. I heard Sophia calling for her missing sketchpad, Heather double-checking the sign-in list for emails and feedback. The retreat was closing, but something inside me had only just begun. I walked through each room slowly, touching the back of a chair, running my palm across the wood table where tears had been shed and bread had been broken. This wasn't just a retreat, it was a reclamation. As I passed the fireplace, I noticed someone had tacked a note to the mosaic wall. No name, just a torn journal page that read, "Thank you for building the place I didn't know I needed." I pressed the note to my chest and closed my eyes. Outside, we gathered for one final moment. Those who remained, arms wrapped in scarves, cups of tea warming cold fingers. We circled around a fire pit, now just smoldering embers, and shared what we were taking back into the world. Some spoke of confidence, others of forgiveness. A few simply said, "My voice." When it came to me, I looked around at these women, once strangers, now witnesses, and I said, "I'm not the same woman who walked into this house a week ago. I came here trying to prove I was worthy. I'm leaving knowing I already was." There was a stillness that followed, the kind that speaks louder than applause. After everyone left, I stayed behind to sweep, to fold blankets, to lock doors and open windows. And then, with the sun beginning to dip behind the pines, I sat down on the back porch, alone. But it didn't feel lonely. It felt earned. All the years of being left out, dismissed, misjudged, it didn't define me. It refined me. I used to think revenge looked like proving everyone wrong. Now, I see it differently. Revenge is living in full color when they only ever saw you in grayscale. It's hosting your own gathering after years of not being invited. It's refusing to disappear quietly, and instead creating a life so rich, so grounded, that their silence can't compete with your joy. This retreat wasn't the end of my story. It was the beginning of a chapter I'm finally writing for myself, one where I don't ask for a seat at their table, because I built my own, and there's always room for someone who thought they didn't belong. If you connected with my journey, please subscribe, like, share, and comment below. Your story matters, and I'd love to hear it.